Hello everyone, this is Bradley. Today we're going to talk about the trigger. I think this is going to be a long series of many short pieces tutorial. The real topic is about execution time of the node tree and ways to improve the node tree and so on. Basically various fundamental aspects in using animation nodes. So let's start. So here we are in Blender and I want first to call your attention on the left upper corner. There's a time information, and this time actually means the amount of time that you need to execute your node tree. So assume it takes 100 milliseconds, then it means you need to take 100 milliseconds to do whatever stuff you want. For example, if I have a node tree to build a growth of a tree, so I have a tree, to grow this tree, it takes 100 milliseconds per frame, or each time of execution actually. Each time of execution. And this time will add up into the time to output an image. For example, if I grow a tree and for each frame, considering eevee, ambient occlusion, screen space refraction, motion blur, depth of fields, volumetrics, it may take 1 second, assume, per frame. Then it means it takes 1.1 seconds to output the image. So this actually means the efficiency of your node tree does affect your final rendering. And it might not be obvious at the first glance about how much time it actually takes or it affects your rendering. You might think, oh, because I'm using cycles, I'm using complex procedural shader or whatever stuff, so it may actually affect the things. But if you're using animation nodes, you do need to be aware with this time. And I want to give you a reference because many people actually don't realize how much of issue of this execution is. I want to give you a reference of my personal experience. So most of the time, my execution time will be maximally less than 300 milliseconds. And most of the time, it will be less than 150 milliseconds. So personally speaking, if there is anything that's beyond 300 milliseconds, this is something that I need to call attention, and I will check whether this node tree is actually working or not. If there is any improvement that I can do to make it more efficient, what's wrong with my node tree and other things. And because I do receive some reports from some people who are using a wrong methods, wrong logic, they finally still end up achieving the results, but the time may be as much as 1 or 2 seconds per execution. This time is actually horrible, because it's per frame. So each frame you're taking 1 to 2 seconds. Even before you're actually render an image. This is incredible. This sacrifices a lot. Just really either you're doing something really crazy or you're doing something incredibly wrong. So this is what I want to say. So to execute the node tree, and obviously you can see the time is not changing. The time is not changing means the node tree is not functioning, or the node tree is not executing itself. So next thing that I would like to discuss is what triggers the execution of your node tree. If we hit N, then there is an M panel coming from right. And in this node tree panel, you can see there is in the first panel, you can see the auto execution. By default, the always is on, and you can see the time is always changing. It means your node tree is executing all the time. And this is very bad because maybe sometimes in the middle of my work, I want to have a rest. I want to have a cup of coffee, so I go away from the keyboard. I'm not even doing anything with Blender or my computer, but this time is still running. I'm just wasting power for nothing. And so basically, if you don't mind your electricity bill, you don't mind the life expectancy of your computer, your CPU, your motherboards, you don't care that your computer is actually heating up due to excessive execution of your node tree, then you can keep this always on. But the most of the time, I would suggest you just to turn off this always, because it produces carbon dioxide, global warming, cut down a lot of trees in order to generate enough electricity. You have to build nuclear power plants for whatever disasters. No, I would say no. Just keep this always off unless you really need that. But I barely think there's some cases you really need that. I would say basically just no. So you can turn on the other three options instead. And so basically, therefore, these three are the basic triggers of animation nodes. So the tree, frame, and the property. So it's actually pretty easy to understand. The tree means just a node tree. So if I add a node, so keep in mind that now the execution time is 0.502 milliseconds. If I take a float input, then immediately it becomes 0.0521 milliseconds. If I duplicate this float input, it becomes 0.04. Duplicate again, it becomes 0.482. So this is the tree change. The second is the frame change. It's just the frame. So basically, it will at least ensure that you got your animation updated each frame as you are trying to render or preview the animation. The third is property change. So if I change the value of this float input, then you can see the execution of the node tree. But if I'm not doing anything with my computer, not doing anything with the Blender, I'm just having a cup of coffee, then this number will not change, as long as you don't keep this always on. This always is so bad, it's just evil. Okay, so these three are basic triggers. Another thing I want to remind you is if I have multiple node tree, because I do have multiple node tree for preset and other things. So in this tracer node tree, if I just take a float input, what you can see is this time does not change as I'm duplicating this float input. This is because I usually keep auto execution off completely. But you will also realize if I'm duplicating this float input, this number will actually change. This number for our node tree will change. This is because the auto execution for this particular node tree will be, so as long as you take that on, the tree, frame, and the property will include many other node tree at the same time. And this is a reason that's why I turn the execution of the other node tree off, so that when I'm working with the node tree, so let's just talk about the main working. Just rename this as working. So if I'm working with the working node tree, the other node tree will not be executed or waste any energy of execution. Otherwise, it will also be a kind of painful experience. Even if it does not take a lot of time to execute, but it's still time that hurts your previewing, hurts your rendering or other things. Okay, so I hope this is kind of clear. There are, however, some cases where these three basic triggers are not enough. So for example, here is a node tree. Here's a node tree. I'm using an empty to drive a cone. So this node tree is kind of very simple, just using an empty to drive a cone. So I try to move this empty, and you can see I'm changing the value of the transform data of this empty but it does not execute the node tree, because the transform data of your empty has nothing to do with tree, frame, and the property. Because the property, so it seems like it's related to property, but the property only includes something within this node tree or other node tree. And this is the moment that you need to additional trigger. So you need to turn on this new trigger. And basically for the trigger, you have three options: object, collection, and scene. You can choose the specific object, and you just need to type in the location, scale, and the rotation ruler. So you can type each of them. So if I type locations, so let's just select our empty. So if I type the locations, so now the location change of my empty will actually execute the node trees. And according to our node tree, the empty location will drive the location of Chrome. However, if I put the rotations, I link the rotation together, the rotation of my empty does not actually affect our comb, because the rotation has not been included as a part of trigger. So what you can also do is you can take rotation and lower dash and take a ruler. It's not a directly rotation, because rotation is a ruler. It contains the ruler. I don't really want to actually explain what ruler is, but basically ruler is just either degree or radius. It's a number with this such kind of unit. Okay, and for scale, just type on scale. So these are the kind of basic statements that you wish to have, and the order does not really matter as long as you have these three statements separated by comma, then it will be fine. But for a single object, sometimes it's kind of inefficient if you're using multiple empties to control multiple objects for whatever reasons. That's why I usually recommend to use this collection and just type a control collection, and sometimes it's good enough. So this is kind of a basic part of the trigger. I'm not familiar with the scene or other things. I barely use them, so I usually just use collection, and it's good enough to do the work. And this is it.
So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll probably see you next time. Bye bye.